Hello, hello. Today I'd like to just show everyone my progress on this little project I have working on the side here. I'm calling it Muddy for short because its inspiration comes from the old times where multi-user dungeons were pretty popular amongst people like myself to enjoy an RPG experience that's kind of like D&D but in digital form. And I wanted to kind of have that experience again. I feel like it would be fun to kind of define the different classes and the interactions in a more modern sense. So here you can see I have just a little design that I whipped up. These images are all generated from Midjourney. Just I wanted to experiment with that to see what I can do with it, and it's pretty cool that you can produce such high quality looking images. There's like little weird details if you kind of focus too much, but otherwise it's actually a pretty good source for images if you're just kind of like wanting to start something and have something actually visually appealing while you're working. So props to Midjourney on that one. But just to get into it, this game, the plan I'm going with is you usually have a nice grid of a map to just kind of explore the world with. Each cell is a part of the world. Generally, you have a nice visual of what part of the world you're in. So in this case, I'm calling it Francoeur Lake. I just made it up in my head. No reference that I'm aware of. And here your typical text prompt. All it does in this setting is just give you information about what's going on in the world. Here I have an example of what a combat might look like, how looting might look, recovery, movement, and a way it describes the environment. And here is what I would refer to as the interaction panel. So if this is the map grid, this is the text output, and this is the interaction panel. Because as you can see, this is in the shape of a phone, iPhone 12 specifically. And I figured like your thumb would be mostly down here most of the time. So your most used actions are probably these movement buttons to go north, south, west, and east, up and down. The left side would be like enemies, maybe objects you can interact with, things like that. And then just a nice little portrait of your character and how much HP they have left. My plan moving forward is just to make it auto attack for now. I don't know if there's going to be any more like actual attacks. I want this to be a pretty casual game. You just kind of like tap an enemy and then the attacks happen and then you can move on to the next area. And when you're done, just log out, move on. That type of thing. So yeah, this is the plan. And the current milestone I'm working on in the app is just to see if I can't get these arrows, these buttons, to move your character around a grid when you click them. Which sounds pretty simple. It is not. At least it wasn't for me. It probably could have been easier if I had more understanding of Redux at the time. I feel like I've reached a milestone in learning that. But just to move on to how I'm setting up the services. As you can see here, I have a Docker Compose, which has a next.js app and a payload app, a Mongo service, and a Mongo Express service. So the next.js app is your actual client and what the end user will actually interact with. It'll handle the state and all that for them on the client side. Then I have Payload, which is a CMS that I recently picked up that I really am enjoying a lot. It's so much fun to work in. It's so open, so clear. It's a nice open source program. I'm not being paid to say this, by the way. This is just a great tool. I would recommend looking it up and trying it out. But yeah, this is basically it. It runs on port 3000. Depends on Mongo, and then Mongo is obviously just being set up, and then Express just in case I need to look into the Mongo database. It's nice to have a tool for that purpose. Structure-wise, it's all mapped into this source folder, where the next app is here and the payload app is here, and I can get into those details later, but I'm going to try to move pretty swiftly here to the next step. So I've already Docker composed up everything. I'll hide this just to make more room. And let's just hop over to the CMS, actually. So here's what a payload looks like if you've configured it a lot, essentially. You define your collections, and I just kind of experimented a bunch here, but mainly I'm focused on the zones because as you can see, the idea here is that you're in a zone, Francoeur Lake, and the zone contains a map, and you traverse that map. So when I set out to work on this, I defined a schema in code. So when you're in code, you define your collection there, and then when you save it, automatically updates here to have the schema that you've defined essentially. So in for Encore Lake here, I've defined a name, description, map code. I found this to be actually fun. I'm not sure if I'm going to stick with this, but I found that these characters are available to map paths out. So you can think of each character as one cell in the grid here. And the character shape is what defines what paths that you can connect to. So the idea is, let's say this guy right here, this cell connects to a northern path and to a western path. So then you would use a character like that to define a path like that. So I basically just put this together. This middle part's like the big portion of the lake. Maybe there's a secret roundabout behind a tree, and maybe there's some secret monsters over here to the right, and all that. I also have support for multiple layers of this. So the idea is if you enter an equals sign and put some more details on the next level, you can define, I didn't know it would collapse. You can define ways these connect to each other. So this would be like Z index level 0, Z index level 1, and so on. I'm not going to save that because I don't want to mess up my demo here. It's pretty stable, but I just don't know where I'm going to end up if I try that. So then here's an example of using blocks in a different way in Payload, because you can define cell mods, for instance. So I set up 3 different blocks that this can accept, a detail, which is basically you specify a block in the template to have more detail to add to it. Spawner, as you can define a monster to show up there and how often it shows up. And a connection, which is basically how you would define ladders or pitfalls to the other levels of the map. And that's pretty much it. So if I show an example of a spawner, the coordinates 2, 6, 0. 0 being this level, there's only one level to that. And then 2, you kind of just go 1, 2, this guy. There's probably nothing actually here, so I probably configured this incorrectly. Maybe this is what I specified here. Oh, it is 6, so yeah. So at that point, basically, I have a lazy frog spawn. Every minute it spawns something, and it only at most spawns one thing. This isn't functional, but I just wanted to show what's going on there. And here I wanted to have like at here just show that there's like an old wooden dock. I'm describing this as a lake full of large lily pads that giant toads kind of hop between, just as an example. Nothing related to the actual lore of the world or anything like that. But again, you give a coordinate, and then this is what should show up when you actually hit that cell in the world, but that's just for later. As you can see here, this is the unique portion. This is JSON that gets compiled whenever I save this collection, and it's based off of what happens here, and then these values get overlaid onto that to produce this. So as you can see, each cell, most cells are empty, therefore you don't see them on the map. If they have a connection, for east or south, for instance, they do show up with the right connections. And then, if you scroll down a bit more, yeah. So here's the example of the spawner being placed at the cell as specified. The ID of that spawner, I'm not sure if that's needed. It might be needed. The mob value that I want to put there. Mobs are defined in the mobs collection here. I only have one. The type of block that's useful on the other side, and then the values for that. And again, more details on this cell. So as you can see, like it was nice to be able to just visually, without having to create a whole new editor, just kind of set up my own template. At some point, I could see it being much more useful to just create an editor, but I wanted to actually just prove out some things before I actually get into making nicer tools for my work. And yeah, and as you can see here, it shows like how to hit the API from the URL. But that's basically it on that front. And just to show you real quick, here's the collection definition of zones. All these different types are defined here. And then I'm also pulling in the blocks to define here for this cell mods block. And then I think the most fun part was the change hook. So I defined a before change hook, which looks like this. And what it's doing here is that it's checking the operation, and on create or on update, I'm parsing the grid that I've defined in the map code, and that's generating a cell matrix. And then I'm applying all those cell mods that I applied before to a modded cell matrix, and then I'm compiling that and saving it to the compiled map portion of that collection. And then that allows me to use that in the API, which is pretty cool, I think. So moving on, I wanted to show how queries can be managed. So like a lot of other CMSs that are doing a similar thing, there is a nice GraphQL interface to be able to build your queries with. I was able to just make sure I got the data I needed first, literally copied this, pasted it into my code, and then used it to make the GraphQL request here. I set up a token to authenticate over, which is a nice feature of Payload, that you can just set up a user and a token with that, and then use that token to always have an authenticated connection. I'm sure later on, as I set up like user accounts and stuff like that, it'll change, but for testing purposes, very convenient. As you can see here, the same data as you saw before, spawner, detail, it all works. Next, I'm just going to get into the JS app here. So the main things that I focused on were the map grid. So this is the component that actually holds the grid itself in a nice viewport. So it manages the cell state, basically. Well, it doesn't manage it directly, but it kind of handles the styles and that such for it. As you can see, I wanted a 9x9 grid. So I set that up, and the cell holder. The first cell holder has 9x9 grid, and then it just takes all the cells. There's going to be 9x9, so 81 cells in a single array. Throws it in there, and then every cell has its, that north, south, east, west property assigned to it. And then the map cell handles the actual rendering of the cell itself. And then here, I'm using a style component. I really love this extension, this package. Really makes it easy to just keep things nice and neat with the component you want to edit. So I recommend that too. But I set up a player position so that it can be positioned in the middle at all times, and it just overlays the other cell holders. So since they're the same size, it's always right in the middle, and all I'm doing is changing the grid state as I move around the map. And that way I'm only showing 81 cells at a time at most, depending on the size of your screen, right? Because you could load this on a different device other than this, right? So yeah, that's all that's going on here. I position things so that it's always in the middle, and anything that's bigger just gets cut off, which I'm totally fine with in this use case. And then moving on to map cell, we have the definition of all the cell properties that come in. I could probably define this properly in the definition here, but I'll do that later. So the idea here is that if something is defined, it'll show a plate, which is that middle square that you see in the grid. If it shows nothing, I don't show anything. And some paths might not, don't have any paths at all, but I want the plate to be shown. Like maybe if it's a jail cell and you just can't get out for some reason. I have no path set just in case. And in the template, it's referred to as a period, just like period, no connections. Here I have two layers. So they have the same map grid layout, which is used using web grid CSS, CSS3 grid. I forget what it's called sometimes. So the tile layer 0, that contains the plate, the 4 connections, and then another layer for the up and down connections, which I'm marking as the upper right and lower left. And just to show you how I plan that out, so here, right here in this gray area with the blue squares on the outside, that's what I'm defining as like the cell at max, right? The pink here is the plate. This is the up. This is the down button that's going to show up at some point. North, south, east, west. And what I did was I basically ran through each division of this cell and defined what the proportions are compared to each other. And then I just pulled that over into CSS Grid. made sure that they had the right values so that it would produce the proper grid. And then I just defined each grid area as such. So north, south, east, west, up, down. And it allowed me to just kind of do this type of thing. That's why I made them a single letter so that I can easily just visualize what's going on instead of having different sized columns, as you can see here. So the first layer has the plate area, the north, east, southwest, and then the second layer has the up and downs that are just going to set on top. And as you can see, it's mainly just presentation only. All it does is just show the proper cell that's being passed into it as it's configured. And then finally, the movement controls. So all that's happening here, there's a lot of behind the scenes work on the Redux side, which I won't get into just for time's sake, but all I'm doing here is I'm defining a dispatch to be able to fire actions off on my my map grid, my map store essentially. And inside that store, there's a grid. The grid makes an API call to payload. The payload returns that API call data. I use that data to store the zone information, and then I run some code to actually extract the current 9x9 grid from that based on your player position. So that's generally what's going on here. So all I have to do is say, hey, go north on the player store. Here's the map grid. And that's how I connect the two. I separated player and then the map grid store. Because I wanted to have one managed and the player managed in another. So I connect them this way because that seems to be what works. So once this dispatches, it'll do some checks, update the viewport state, and then since map grid is pulling in the viewport state from the cells, it just maps that into there and automatically updates the state of the map. So as you can see, oh, real quick, this is Mongo Express. Nice to see all the data just directly if you ever have any problems that you're running into. But yeah, here it is. Here's the thing. I'll just go into iPhone mode. Make it a little bigger. Yeah, how about that? So as you can see here, I just have a very rough interface right now, but this viewport, as you can see, is a 9x9 grid. It's being cut off by the viewport at the moment because it's just going to take up that top portion, but it's all there, and if it ever gets taller, it'll be showing that value. And we can do that. As you can see, everything is split up as properly as you would think. If I go in deeper, each one of these has a grid. So let's go to one we can actually see. It's not cut off by the, yeah, we'll go to this one. And as you can see here, that is all divided, subdivided in the way I expected, which is pretty cool. So just not to show that clutter. Cool. So the moment of truth is when I hit north, I go north, as you can see. Wish I could easily remove this. How did I do this? Anyway. I have to just deal with it for now, I guess. Yeah, I'm not sure why it's not going away. Probably because I'm doing something wrong. That said, so north, as you can see, if you can't go north anymore, it stops you. Go south. And you can also tell that it is following the template that I defined in text, which is pretty cool. Just exploring the lake now. Wow, what a beautiful lake, right? It's got frogs. It doesn't even have frogs. It's got nothing but cells. Of course, I'm going to have like colorings and stuff like that, but super happy that this worked out. Yeah, this will be where the doc message would show up in the text below here. So super excited about my progress here. It was a very difficult task just in terms of learning. I'm sure it'll get easier as I get more used to React and Redux. But yeah, I really appreciate the time you guys have taken to come along with me on this journey. Have a good one.